When modern academics encounter Vedantic texts, they typically try to force them into one of two familiar boxes: an Eastern philosophy or a mystical religion. Categorizing Vedanta as a philosophy is a critical error. Western philosophy, built heavily on the dualism of thinkers like René Descartes, relies on systematic, profane, and individualistic reasoning. It is equally incorrect to classify it as a religion. Vedanta requires no theology, involves no historical narrative, and demands no belief in religious dogma. As the French metaphysician René Guénon argued, Vedanta is pure metaphysics. It is Brahma Vidya, the direct, unbounded knowledge of the universal, entirely detached from human contingencies. Western philosophical structures, like the monads of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, are essentially closed loops. They try to encapsulate truth within rigid, bounded systems defined by the limits of the author's mind. Vedantic non-duality explicitly rejects these arbitrary boundaries. Standard Western intellectual tools, like the Cartesian division between mind and body, or spirit and matter, map onto an entirely different architectural model of existence. They are completely incompatible here. To accurately read Vedantic texts, we have to stop trying to translate them into European categories. We have to entirely discard our established conceptual vocabulary and adopt the ontological framework the texts themselves provide. In the Western intellectual tradition, knowledge is constructed bottom-up, through empirical observation and discursive human logic. Vedanta operates in reverse. Its foundational baseline is Shruti. This refers to core texts like the Upanishads, which are not the product of human reasoning or observation, but the fruit of direct intellectual intuition. They possess their own independent, intrinsic authority. Because Shruti is a direct apprehension of universal truth rather than a constructed argument, it serves as an absolute, unalterable metaphysical baseline. This is strictly separated from Smrti, which translates as memory. Smrti encompasses the vast body of traditional commentary and logical deduction. It relies on discursive thought and derives its authority solely from its alignment with Shruti. This establishes the primary rule of Vedantic study. In any moment of doubt or apparent contradiction, Shruti holds supreme and final authority. Because the foundation is pure intellectual intuition, our investigation into the human state cannot start by analyzing human behavior or anatomy. We must proceed top-down, starting from absolute, universal axioms. To map the architecture of existence, we start with the highest ontological division, the separation of the universal from the individual. In Vedantic doctrine, the true self, Atma, belongs exclusively to the universal. It is the unconditioned, permanent principle of all existence. This is entirely distinct from the human I, or Jivatma. The I is merely a contingent, localized, and transient manifestation. It is an individual state, not the permanent principle. This diagram plots the exact distinction. Modern thinkers consistently make the error of confusing the universal with the general. The general is simply a mathematical extension of the individual. A collective group of human bodies is still bound by the same limitations as a single human body. The true universal transcends form, quantity, and individual limitation entirely. The absolute highest state of this universal is pure non-manifestation. It is the unconditioned state, containing all possible realities simultaneously without taking on the limiting conditions of any of them. Because Atma remains in this unconditioned state, it is entirely unaffected by whatever happens within the individual manifested states of existence below it. The true self resides entirely outside the boundaries of human individuality. This creates a structural mismatch. Psychological frameworks, confined to the personal I, attempt to measure an unconditioned principle using the localized metrics of a contingent state. To see where the human state actually sits, we track the topological cascade from the unmanifested universal down into the manifested world. Looking at this topological map, the first step down from absolute non-manifestation is formless manifestation.
Because this state is devoid of form, it remains supra-individual. It acts as a bridge, retaining its universal nature while laying the groundwork for individual existence. The threshold is crossed when we reach formal manifestation. This is the strict domain of the individual, where existence is finally bound by the limiting condition of shape and form. This formal domain is further divided into a hierarchy, the subtle state and the gross state.
The gross state is the purely corporeal, physical, and sensible world. It is the dense matter we observe and measure. Sitting immediately above it is the subtle state. This contains the vast spectrum of extracorporeal extensions of the individual, mental and vital faculties that retain form but lack physical density. The complete human individual comprises both the gross and the subtle states simultaneously. When mapped against the entire architecture of existence, the physical human body studied by empirical science represents only an infinitesimal fraction of a single state, existing within an indefinite multitude of states. If the supreme principle, Atma, is entirely unmoving and immutable, we are left with a massive mechanical problem. How does this vast cascade of manifestation actually occur? The generation of existence requires a primordial polarization of being into two distinct poles, Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is the active, essential determinant. It is the luminous principle that orders and structures existence, but it does not act or immerse itself within the manifestation. Prakriti is the exact opposite. It is a completely passive, undifferentiated primordial substance. It is the root potential from which all forms are produced. Prakriti is not Cartesian matter. It is pure, unformed potentiality, containing three internal tendencies, or gunas, held in perfect static equilibrium. Manifestation begins when the mere presence of Purusha disrupts this equilibrium. Purusha actualizes the potential locked within Prakriti, drawing out the cascade of forms without ever entering or mixing with the substance itself. Vedantic texts explain this non-acting influence through a precise visual metaphor, the sun reflecting on the surface of turbulent water. The single unmoving sun in the sky is the universal spirit. The shifting, breaking reflections trapped in the ripples below represent individual human beings experiencing the endless modifications of form and time. The physical sun is entirely unaffected by the ripples in the pond. If the water boils, freezes, or dries up entirely, the light source remains exactly as it was. The pain, pleasure, and physical modifications of the human individual never touch or alter the Supreme Self. We have mapped the absolute top of the ontological hierarchy, but to have any relevance, this metaphysical reality must anchor itself within the specific human individual. Vedantic doctrine identifies exactly where this intersection occurs. The supreme principle effectively resides at the exact vital center of the human state. This location is symbolically identified as the heart. In the Upanishads, it is explicitly named Brahmapura, the city of Brahma. Brahmapura is the metaphysical center of the integral individuality, encompassing both the subtle and gross states. It is distinct from the physiological organ that pumps blood. Deep within the microscopic cavity of this center, the unconditioned Atma is present, frequently symbolized in traditional texts as a tiny, luminous seed. The absolute, infinite reality is not located out there in the distant cosmos. It is structurally embedded at the absolute ontological core of our own being. This presents a final paradox. How can the limitless, unmanifested universal fit inside the localized center of a human individual? The texts resolve this through the rule of inverse analogy. Because manifestation is a reflection of reality, it inverts the properties of the principle. What is supreme and infinite in principle appears as the smallest and most hidden entity within the realm of manifestation. As the Chandogya Upanishad states, this Atma which resides in the heart is smaller than a grain of rice, smaller than a grain of barley, smaller than a grain of mustard, smaller than a grain of millet. Yet the text immediately dictates the inverse absolute truth. This Atma, which resides in the heart, is also greater than the earth, greater than the atmosphere, greater than the sky, greater than all these worlds together.
the individual is infinitely more vast and complex than empirical science assumes, stretching deep into the subtle and formless states. Yet that entire massive structure of individuality is entirely illusory when compared to the absolute infinite reality of Atma. The term yoga identifies the realization of this pre-existing eternal identity between the individual and the universal, a strictly metaphysical definition distinct from physical postures. Metaphysics is the recognition of the immutable, eternal architecture that has always constituted our true nature.